Hello, welcome to MEMO's weekly review show with me, Nasim Ahmed. Joining me is our regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. In today's show, we'll be discussing the decision to suspend funding to UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Work Agency. Israeli ministers attend march in support of ethnic cleansing in Gaza. We'll be speaking about also the Friday's judgment by the ICJ over South Africa's genocide case against Israel, and the more recent news of 3 American soldiers who were killed in Jordan. And we'll be asking, is it time for us to start describing the US as Israel's proxy? So that's for later, but let's begin with the suspension of funding to UNRWA, Moin. It said that the fundings will run out within weeks, and that's quite a shocking news. Especially given the context on which this decision has been taken, and also the fact that the allegation is that only 12 members of UNRWA staff out of 30,000 has been allegedly linked to the 7th October attack. What do you make of that?
Yes, I mean it's a big deal, as you just said. UNRWA has indicated that it will not be able to provide its vital and now urgently needed services in the Gaza Strip past the end of February at the latest because of these funding cutoffs. I have to say this is a quite extraordinary story because 12 UNRWA staff members have been accused by Israel of being connected to the Hamas attacks of 7 October 2023. There has been absolutely no allegation that UNRWA as an agency was in any way involved or had any knowledge of the alleged involvement of these 12. There has as yet been nothing beyond allegations, unproven, yet to be investigated, no trials, no convictions. Yet the United States, the United Kingdom, the European Union, and a growing number of European governments, including, I believe, also Australia and Canada, reacted almost instantaneously by suspending their funding to this agency in the immediate aftermath of the ruling by the International Court of Justice that there needs to be reliable and increased provision of life-saving humanitarian supplies to the civilian population of the Gaza Strip. I know we'll be speaking about the ICJ later. At this point, I'd just like to say that I think these two developments are very much connected. Israel has been sitting on these allegations for a long time. It chose to release them almost immediately after the ICJ provisional ruling, interim ruling, came out this past Friday. So it was quite clearly an exercise in diverting attention. And I think Western states responded quite simply, oh, you think international law also applies to us? Well, here you go. In exchange, you're going to get famine in the Gaza Strip. I think that's one aspect of it. Another one is just the sheer hypocrisy of it all. As Sarah Leah Whitson, the former Middle East director at Human Rights Watch, and now the executive director of Democracy for the Arab World Now, Dawn noted in a Twitter post, it took U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken seconds to respond to these unproven allegations and immediately cut off aid to UNRWA. But in response to the ICJ's ruling that Israel now stands plausibly accused of genocide, let alone the tens of thousands of dead and wounded since October of last year, and the systematic razing of large areas of the Gaza Strip to the ground, there's been nothing. You know, the weapons consignments continue without proper review by the US Congress. The vetoes have continued, and so on and so forth. I thought the response of Chris Gunness, the former spokesperson of UNRWA, was quite fitting. He compared these allegations to the case of Lucy Letby, the National Health Service nurse who was convicted of murdering a series of infants under her care in British hospitals. And in her case, she was able to conduct these murders precisely because she was working in NHS facilities. Well, no one has suggested these murders were committed by the NHS or that the NHS had any knowledge of them or that the NHS is in any way responsible for them. So the equivalent would be the British government in response to the initial allegations against Lucy Letby, severing all funding to the NHS. It's really quite extraordinary.
Yeah, and to add to that, what about the hundreds of Israeli soldiers who have made genocidal statements, Israeli leaders who have made genocidal statements? So it very much feels like collective punishment against the Palestinians. But the real effect is that that means as much as $667 million of worth of pledges will not be received by UNRWA. That's 60% of its budget. And it's a lot considering what they're having to deal with right now. But this is not the first time, of course, UNRWA has been attacked. UNRWA has been a main target for the Israelis.
ואי אפשר יהיה לנצח את המלחמה אם אנחנו לא נשמיד את אונר"א, וההשמדה הזו חייבת להתחיל מיד. זה לא...
For many, many years, during the Trump era, Trump cut off funding, Biden reinstated, and now again done what no one would have imagined was follow Trump again in defunding UNRWA. Why do you think UNRWA's constantly been targeted by the Israelis since its founding in 1948? Some of our viewers may not know the history behind it, but why is UNRWA why does it receive such a hostile response from the Israelis?
No, I think that's precisely the issue that needs to be addressed. Before answering you, I'd just like to elaborate just a little bit on your reference to Biden and Trump, which is that when the Biden administration took office, it pointedly refused to reverse any of the initiatives that the Trump administration had taken with respect to Palestine. It did not relocate the US embassy to Israel back to Tel Aviv from Jerusalem. It did not reopen the US consulate in East Jerusalem, which served primarily as its direct line of communications to the Palestinians. It did not allow the reopening of the PLO mission in Washington. It did not reverse the recognition of Israeli sovereignty over Jerusalem and the recognition of the Israeli annexation of East Jerusalem and of the Syrian Golan Heights. The only divergence from Trump's multiple initiatives that was taken by the Biden administration was, as you mentioned, to resume funding to the UN Refugee Agency for Palestine Refugees, UNRWA. And now that has been made consistent with Trump's policy as well. So Biden's policy towards Israel and Palestine is now literally indistinguishable from that of the Trump administration. Up to and including, I should add, that the Biden administration has prioritized Arab-Israeli normalization over resolving the question of Palestine, prioritized Arab-Israeli normalization at the expense of resolving the question of Palestine, exactly as a Trump administration sought to do. Now, getting back to your question, I think the issue here is that Israel, many members in the US Congress and to a certain extent in Europe as well, have for many years been arguing that the Palestine refugee question does not really exist. These people are not legitimate refugees. These people have no claim or right of return. These people should simply be resettled in other countries and basically shoved into the dustbin of history, put down the memory bowl, if you will. And part of this argument is that these Palestinians are not even fully aware of their own rights. Their claims are artificial. Their identity as refugees is artificially constructed. And who is who do they consider the main culprit in this fantasy scenario? It is UNRWA. Palestinian refugees are seen as these ignorant, passive, unknowing collection of individuals who, were it not for UNRWA, would have no identity, no claims upon their rights, no collective agency. But it is somehow UNRWA, which after all is a humanitarian agency with no political mandate, that is somehow held responsible for the persistence of the refugee question. In other words, it's not Israel's denial of their rights, but UNRWA's very existence that is responsible for the persistence of these issues. So UNRWA serves very much as the main and most visible surrogate for a much broader agenda, which is the effort to liquidate and eliminate the Palestinian refugee question. And that, I think, is a primary motivation for these decades of attacks upon the agency that you've referenced.
Yeah, and the next story we want to tackle is very much linked to what you've been saying about Palestinians being denied their right to nationhood as a people, as a nation with long tradition and connection with Palestine, is what happened in Israel over the weekend. Yesterday, actually, 12 Israeli ministers, a third of the current ministers, they took part in a mass rally wanting to ethnically cleanse and expel Palestinians from Gaza. Again, it goes back to the fact that many Israelis don't consider Palestinians to be a real nation, a real people with connection to Palestine, which is why they can advocate for such policies of resettlement, of expulsion, as you've mentioned. So it seems, despite Washington's condemnations, ethnic cleansing, it's still high on the agenda as far as the current Israeli cabinet is concerned.
Yes, I mean, I should point out it's not official government policy, although virtually every Israeli official has at one point in the past few months advocated for this policy. But what you had here was a gathering of several thousand people that, as you mentioned, was attended by a third of the Israeli cabinet and was addressed by two of Israel's most prominent ministers, the Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, and the Minister of Finance, Bezalel Smotrich. I mean, it would be the equivalent of the Home Secretary and the Chancellor of the Exchequer addressing a gathering in London and then having to be told, oh, actually, this is insignificant and irrelevant. Don't take it seriously. Well, it doesn't work that way. And their agenda was twofold. First, as you mentioned, to rejuvenate this agenda of the ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip. And it was very explicitly stated that these Palestinians in the Gaza Strip need to be moved out of the Gaza Strip. And secondly, and not less importantly, the revival of the Jewish settlement project in the Gaza Strip. And again, this was all very explicitly stated. I think there are several dimensions to this. Part of it is that the Israeli far right sees this as a winning electoral agenda. And of course, most Israeli politicians now have come to the conclusion that new Israeli elections, or at least new coalition negotiations, may be in the offing sooner rather than later, because Netanyahu's position as prime minister is becoming increasingly untenable. And some believe that the main contest will be between, let's say, the establishment right, which is a Likud, and the far right, represented by these fascist parties of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. And although we make all these pretensions that we do these things and we say these things because we think we're powerful and can act independently and can show the middle finger to the entire world, including our sponsors in Brussels and Washington, we know we can do these things because Biden and Brussels have our back. That's, I think, the first observation I would make. The second is that the response contrasts very sharply with the response to the issue we've just discussed, namely the severance of funding to UNRWA. So it's perfectly acceptable to have a third of the Israeli government attending a rally that explicitly calls for the expulsion, the ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip and its colonization, illegal colonization by Jewish settlers. That's fine. We'll just pretend it didn't happen. And if we have to give a response, we'll try to characterize it as some kind of fringe meeting. But if 12 out of whatever they are, 13,000 UNRWA employees are accused of a crime, well, then we'll immediately seek to obliterate the entire agency.
Let's just acknowledge, if it happened in any other country, a third of the cabinet went to a march like this, we'll describe it for what it was, a fascistic campaign to ethnically cleanse people. That's how it would be described in any other scenario. But of course, here, there's a reluctance
Here it's democracy at work.
Yeah. Let's turn our attention to the big story from last week. From Friday, the International Court of Justice issued its judgment on the South Africa case, lodged by South Africa, I should say. Before we go into it, just give us some of your initial thoughts on the ICJ decision. I mean, did you expect it to be so swift? Is that a good sign? And your general perspective on that.
Well, I expected it to be reasonably swift because I looked at the precedents, the genocide cases involving Bosnia, Myanmar, and Ukraine, and the initial ruling in those cases was within a roughly comparable time frame. I also think that the ruling issued by the International Court of Justice was on the whole consistent with those previous cases. Many people have pointed out the discrepancy between what the court ordered with respect to Palestine in comparison with Ukraine. But I think that is very much of an apple and oranges type scenario, because the Ukraine case, although it was about genocide, was a fundamentally different case than this one. The second reaction I would make is that don't confuse the ICJ with the UN Security Council. The ICJ can offer a legal opinion. That legal opinion can be binding on all member states, but it does not have any enforcement capabilities, nor are its rulings self-implementing. The only way its rulings can be enforced is if the UN Security Council adopts a resolution demanding compliance. And in this case, that's clearly not going to happen because of the US veto at the Security Council. So I think people were preparing to judge the judgment of the ICJ, if you will, by whether or not it called for a ceasefire. That to me was a very secondary issue. First of all, because the call for an immediate ceasefire would have been inconsistent with the two most relevant precedents, namely Bosnia and Myanmar. And second of all, because it would have been just ink on paper. So it may have had symbolic value, but it would have changed literally nothing on the ground. Much more important, indeed, the central issue, in my view, was whether or not the court would rule that South Africa had plausibly accused Israel of committing genocide in the Gaza Strip. And it did. And it did so by an overwhelming majority. And that to me is a game changer, not in terms of changing anything on the ground, but in terms of Israel taking one more step towards becoming a pariah state, the way South Africa was in the 1970s and 1980s, and for that matter, the way Israel had been in the years before the 1991 peace process began. And the idea that Israel is now forever associated with genocide, not as a victim, but as a perpetrator, has, in my view, enormous and permanent significance. It's now become much easier for people to criticize Israel and its policies without being demonized and delegitimized and so on, the way that, or even criminalized in some cases, the way that has often been the case in the West. It's going to become much more difficult to defend Israel. And it's going to be much more difficult, I think, to attack those who criticize Israel. And another aspect is the ruling of the International Court of Justice is binding not only on South Africa and Israel, it is binding upon every state party to the 1948 Genocide Convention. That includes the United States, that includes Canada and Australia and New Zealand, that includes the United Kingdom, and that includes the member states of the European Union. And so, at least formally, in a legal sense, they will now have to ensure that their policies reflect the rulings, the provisional measures ordered by the ICJ, and that their policies cannot be seen as complicity with genocide in the Gaza Strip. I think their response, of course, has been very different, as we were discussing, to basically engineer famine in the Gaza Strip. In part, I think,
which makes the decision to suspend funding of UNRWA all the more strange, because one of the requirements of the judgment is that Israel does everything to make sure humanitarian aid reaches Palestinians, that humanitarian aid is not obstructed. And therefore, when you consider that UNRWA is the biggest aid organization delivering assistance to the Palestinians, how on earth are they supposed to meet those obligations? And just to add to that, I mean, you spoke about ceasefire. I mean, is it even possible to uphold or comply with the provisional measures without a ceasefire itself? I mean, that is the broader question. I don't think you can. That's one interpretation. I don't think you can, meet the requirements of the order from the ICJ without a ceasefire. That's one interpretation. And add to that, of course, the cutting of funding to UNRWA, that just makes it seem like you're going completely against the ICJ decision.
Well, precisely. And many people, including senior United Nations humanitarian figures such as Martin Griffiths and Philip Lazzarini, have made precisely this point, that there can't be aid deliveries under the current circumstances. And in the absence of a ceasefire, aid can't be delivered. And I think a number of legal analysts have come to the conclusion that if you read the provisional measures properly, implicit in them is the call for a ceasefire. Whatever that may be, the bottom line, I think, is on the one hand what you've stated, on the other that the court, for reasons of its own, chose not to explicitly order a ceasefire. And I think perhaps another reason it didn't do so is because South Africa did not ask the court to offer a judgment on the legality of Israel's military operations in the Gaza Strip. And the court, I think, took a decision not to wade into this political hornet's nest. But again, I think the key issue is that, we can be disappointed, we can criticize the court for not having done that, but even if it had fulfilled our highest expectations with regard to a ceasefire, unfortunately, it would have changed nothing on the ground. And therefore, in my view, much more important is that it has judged that South Africa has plausibly accused Israel of genocide. Getting back to the other part of your question, you're exactly right. I mean, if there is no humanitarian aid to be delivered to the Gaza Strip, Israel can no longer be accused of obstructing those deliveries. And I think in part also, these Western governments know exactly what they're doing. This is in part their decision to suspend or cut off funding to UNRWA is in part for the reasons we've discussed, and it's in part a retaliatory measure against South Africa and the International Court of Justice, along the lines of, oh, you're now going to claim that international law applies to us and not only to others. Do you really think that Israel is going to be held accountable for anything and is not going to continue to act with impunity? Well, if that's your view, enjoy your famine.
I mean, one article I was reading this week, the author went as far as to say we're in a situation now where the clashes between the international legal system, international legal order against the international US hegemony. These are the two big clashes that's taking place between the international law and between the law of US hegemony. And I thought it's quite a powerful way to present what's happening right now with the ICJ. I for one was quite surprised because it surpassed my expectation. I did not expect such a positive verdict from the ICJ. And on the ceasefire question, I wanted to share this quote from someone, an activist, Ali Abu Nema, and I thought it's a very carefully explained. He basically says that a ceasefire is what you demand in an armed conflict, but in a genocide, you demand an immediate end to all genocidal act. And that is exactly what the ICJ ordered with the immediate effect. So
that's well put.
Yeah, that's a very, very well put explanation why they wouldn't call for a ceasefire. Another thing that struck me is the response from Washington and Israel's Western allies. There seems to be an attempt to gaslight the international community. Everyone, we've heard what we've heard, we've seen the judgment. There seems to be an effort to completely spin this whole thing as a success for Israel. What do you make of that?
Yes, I mean, as you indicated, this is really a contest, if you will, between the Western designed and constructed rules-based international order on the one hand, an order in which international law applies only to enemies and adversaries, whereas those who designed this order are free to violate it at will if it serves their interests. That on the one hand, and the norms and principles and universal application of international law on the other. So you could look at it perhaps more broadly as the West versus the international community. And I think the distinction between those two is becoming increasingly clear and increasingly large. Secretary of State Antony Blinken dismissed South Africa's case as meritless before it was even presented excuse me, before it was even presented to the ICJ. And in the aftermath of the ruling, the White House spokesperson, John Kirby, made a point of informing the assembled press that the court had not found Israel guilty of genocide. Well, it had not been found not guilty of genocide either, for the simple reason that the full and proper hearings on whether or not Israel is guilty of genocide, which have now been ordered to be held by the court, have not even started. So getting back to Lucy Letby, who we were discussing somewhat earlier, it would be the equivalent of declaring Lucy Letby innocent on the first day of her trial because she had not yet been convicted. It's absurd. Finally, if I can make an additional point about the ICJ. Of course, ICJ judges serve in their personal capacity and are formally, at least, independent in the sense that they're not diplomats who follow instructions from their capitals. Nevertheless, I found it quite fitting and quite interesting and in a sense also quite important that this judgment was delivered by an American judge, Joan Donoghue, in her capacity as the current president of the court, in American English, extensively quoting UN officials and documents and so on. And I think, that's the senior American official, if you will, that we should listen to, not Kirby or Blinken. And just as importantly, I think it's also noteworthy, as was pointed out by Norman Finkelstein, that not only did Judge Donahue vote with a majority on every single measure, and it was an overwhelming majority, either 16-1 or 16-2, but she did not feel compelled to offer an explanation of her position and of her vote in the way that others did. So you have, for example, the American judge, the German judge, Nolte, who felt the need to offer an explanation of his vote in which he sought to downplay South Africa's accusations and made the case that he didn't find South Africa's presentations convincing, and that under different circumstances, he would have voted against all the provisional measures and basically would have argued to have the case dismissed, but that the level of incitement to genocide by Israeli leaders and officials tied his hands and left him with no choice. The American judge did not feel the need to issue a statement downplaying South Africa's presentation and explaining why she nevertheless voted for them. And then, of course, you have the Ugandan judge, who seems to have been in utter confusion about this case for two
She's
reasons.
been disowned now as not. She's been
Yes,
disowned
she's
by
been
Uganda.
disowned by her own government. But again, I think she was not under an obligation to follow instructions from her government, and made that very clear. In her explanation for her vote, she said that the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians is I believe she referred to it as a territorial dispute that should be resolved by diplomacy and negotiations rather than in a court of law. Well, there's two problems with that. Is that, first of all, she was not asked to judge on a dispute between Israel and the Palestinians, but rather on a dispute between South Africa and Israel. And second of all, well, it may be a territorial dispute or a political dispute or a dispute that needs to be negotiated. The fact of the matter is that the reason this case landed on her desk is because it concerned a very specific legal document known as a 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And to, pretend that this has nothing to do with international law is really the height of absurdity.
I know there are two different institutions, the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. There is an ongoing case at the ICC, but the current prosecutor seems to be dragging his feet. So do you think the ICJ decision will put pressure on Karim Khan to stop dragging his feet and start prosecuting Israeli officials? And what do you think?
Well, I think it's a difficult question to answer because on the one hand, Karim Khan may respond to this by now dragging his feet even more. As you rightly point out, these are two different institutions with two different mandates and so on. But he could hide behind this investigation to withhold from judgments on his own on the pretext that it might interfere with orderly process at the ICJ. On the other hand, it could result in sufficient public pressure for him to move forward. Now, just given his record, I'd like to point to several possible scenarios. The first is that the ICJ case is only considering the case. Sorry, I'll repeat that. The first point is that the ICJ case is only considering the genocidal actions of Israel. It's only going to offer a judgment on whether or not Israel is guilty of genocide. And the reason that it's doing so is that the state of Palestine has not been accused of genocide, and Hamas is not a state and is therefore not a party to the Genocide Convention. So Hamas as a movement can't be accused unless the state of Palestine is accused, and the state of Palestine is formally accused of responsibility for the actions of Hamas, much as in the Bosnia case. The Bosnian government bought a case arguing that Serbia is responsible for the genocidal actions of the Bosnian Serbs within Bosnia. That leaves open the possibility that what Karim Khan will actually do is that he will seek to fill the gap, if you will, and begin to prosecute individual Palestinians for commission of genocide on October 7th. Personally, I don't think the evidence in either intent or in fact is there for a case of genocide against individual Palestinians, but this may well be how he will proceed, and then claiming, that there needs to be proper balance and accountability and so on. Second point is that the International Criminal Court will only prosecute individuals in cases where the national judiciary has either failed or refused to hold individuals accountable for crimes as defined by the Rome Statute. And I found it quite telling that on his recent visit to Israel, and I should add, we've heard absolutely nothing from him on this issue since, I find it quite telling that on this visit, he provided fulsome praise to the Israeli judiciary. An Israeli judiciary that has been denounced and dismissed by every human rights investigation that has looked into it, has been denounced and dismissed as a sham that basically exists to legalize Israeli impunity in its dealings with Palestinians and to whitewash Israeli crimes. Nevertheless, Karim Khan, in his infinite wisdom, found that this is a more or less perfectly functioning judiciary capable of fulfilling its functions under the Rome Statute. What that means, that proceeding from that position, Karim Khan has offered himself a pretext not to prosecute any Israeli leaders or individuals for violations of the Rome Statute, because he will be of the view that they will be held accountable by the Israeli judiciary, and therefore he will only be responsible for prosecuting Palestinians. My sense is that that will be the general approach he will take. Of course, I'm speculating. I don't have any inside knowledge, but I think that's the direction he's going in. And then he may also throw in a few Jewish settlers from the West Bank, so that he's not accused of a
whitewash.
Yes, of a dereliction of duty that requires his dismissal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we spend a lot of time on the ICJ. So let's go on to the next story from the weekend. Next big story, actually. 3 US soldiers were killed in Jordan. There's been some confusion as to where exactly the attack came from. But this seems to be another example of escalation and the war going not according to at least Washington's plan. So, I mean, how shallow, in your mind, has the insistence on the Biden administration that this has nothing to do with Gaza? These are just terrorist organizations attacking Israeli interests and extremists who are orchestrated by Iran.
I'm sorry, Nasim, but I think I had an internet problem and you froze for several seconds. If you
Okay, all right. So let me repeat that. Okay. So let's start that again. So we spend a lot of time on the ICJ. The next big story from the weekend is the killing of 3 US soldiers in Jordan. So that is another example of the escalation of the conflict. Biden, as we know, has been saying that he wants to contain this. He does not want this to escalate. But then again, he's attacked the Houthis. And this is another example of the escalation. Despite that, they keep insisting that this has nothing to do with Gaza. So how shallow, in your view, is this, the insistence by the Biden administration that it has nothing to do with Gaza? And also, is the war now taking a path which the extremists in Washington, extremists in Israel, extremists in other parts of the world are clearly hoping to achieve?
Yes, I mean, you look at Yemen, Ansarullah leaders have made explicitly clear from the very outset that the only reason they're engaging in these activities and attacks in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden and the Arabian Sea has to do with Gaza. It's exclusively because of Israel's genocidal onslaught and siege of the Gaza Strip. And the moment this onslaught and siege ends, their attacks will cease. Nevertheless, Washington insists Ansarullah doesn't know what it's talking about, and that it really has nothing to do with Gaza, because Washington apparently has a better understanding of what the Houthis are doing than the Houthis themselves. The other point is that, as numerous analysts have been pointing out from the beginning, escalation may come deliberately, it may come inadvertently, but what they're all agreed upon is that the longer this goes on, the more likely escalation becomes, whether deliberate or inadvertent. And what we saw yesterday was a deliberate escalation. And it happened because we keep climbing up the escalatory ladder, so to speak. And the longer this conflict continues, the higher up the escalatory ladder we will go. So from the outset, the Biden administration has had a clear choice. If you want to avoid further regional escalation, there's a very simple method to achieve that. Biden picks up his phone, he calls Netanyahu, as he did in 2021, and says, Bibi, you've run out of road. And within 24 hours, the entire thing comes to an end. This is not something the US wants to do. The US is deeply invested in Israel's genocidal onslaught and the success of its campaign, which appears ever more elusive. And therefore, the option that has been chosen by Washington is not to call for a ceasefire in Gaza, but to seek conflict with those who are themselves engaging in armed operations in order to compel a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. And this brings us every time one step closer to a full-scale regional conflict. I think yesterday's attack is significant because it is the first one in which U.S. The deaths of U.S. soldiers, service members, have been confirmed. And this makes it virtually inevitable, I think, that the U.S. response will be significantly more escalatory than its previous responses to attacks on U.S. Military facilities in Syria and Iraq, which did not result in the killings of U.S. service members.
And you had a long tweet on X related to that. And I very much want to ask you about one specific comment you made. I thought it was very insightful. You said that the US is functioning as Israel's proxy, now fighting on multiple fronts, its soldiers dying to defend Israel and protect its ability to continue fighting in the Gaza Strip. So let's explain that for us. What do you mean by the statement that the US is becoming Israel's proxy?
Well, I made this statement against the background of the US-Israeli strategic relationship and the way that this relationship is supposed to work, like similar relationships the US maintains elsewhere in the world, is that the US is a superpower and Israel is a proxy. It is Israel that is supposed to defend and promote U.S. influence and interests in the Middle East, not the other way around. So in a sense, the deal is that the U.S. guarantees Israel's security, and Israel does the U.S.'s dirty work in the region. That at least is a theory. The practice is that Israel has failed to keep its end of the bargain because Israel appears incapable of fulfilling its end of the bargain. It's now been waging war in Gaza for well over 100 days, the longest war in Israeli history since 1948, 1949, and it still hasn't achieved anything. And we're not talking about Egypt or Hezbollah here. We're talking about Hamas, which is not exactly the most powerful military force in the region, or Israel's most powerful adversary. And so rather than Israel ensuring that the Suez Canal remains open and that Ansar Allah don't present a threat to maritime shipping at Bab el-Mandab, rather than Israel ensuring that these groups associated with the axis of resistance no longer hit U.S. targets in the Middle East, it is the U.S. that is having to come to the region and wage war in the Red Sea, in Iraq, in Syria. Is it primarily to defend direct U.S. interests? No, it is to ensure that Israel can continue unmolested with its genocidal onslaught on the Gaza Strip. So in a sense, the relationship has been reversed, and it is the U.S. doing Israel's dirty work rather than the other way around, as it's supposed to be. But I should add that, you know, this, of course, is somewhat of a simplification, because I think if you look at it from the perspective of U.S. leaders in Washington, I think part of the problem is not that I don't believe they put Israeli interests ahead of American interests. I think that the real fundamental problem is that they are incapable of distinguishing between Israeli and U.S. interests. In other words, from their perspective, an Israeli success is an American success, and an Israeli failure is an American failure that will reflect negatively on the U.S. position regionally and geopolitically. And I think that's why they're so heavily invested in this. But again, Israel is failing to perform its assigned role. And I also gave the example in the old city of Jerusalem. Some of your viewers who have been there may recall that you would see these T-shirts being sold everywhere, emblazoned with the image of an Israeli fighter jet and the slogan, "Don't worry, America, Israel is behind you." And I concluded that, given what we've seen in terms of the mediocrity of the Israeli military these past 100+ days, that those T-shirts now can probably be obtained at a very steep discount.
So that wraps up another episode. That was my guest, Mouin Rabbani. Thank you for tuning in. See you next week for another episode of the MEMO Review Show with me, Nasim Ahmed. Take care. Bye-bye.